You're in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, somewhere over occupied France. Your altimeter reads 18,000 feet, standard fighter sweep altitude. From up here, the world is neat and small, patchwork fields, the silver ribbon of the Seine, dark smudges where German airfields sit. You feel safe at this height. You're wrong. In the summer of 1943, American fighter pilots were dying at 18,000 feet, faster than the Army Air Forces could replace them. Between June and September 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 214 fighters over Europe, not to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion, but to German fighters that could climb faster, turn tighter, and had been fighting these skies since 1940. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Fw-190s owned the band between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. They'd perfected the bounce, diving out of the sun, shredding a Thunderbolt with 20mm cannon fire, then climbing away before the American pilot even knew what hit him. Every mission briefing became a casualty prediction. Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group at Haleforth, watched too many empty chairs appear in the mess hall. Doctrine wasn't working. The Army Air Forces trained every pilot to keep the altitude advantage, to fight vertically, never surrender your height. It was gospel. It was getting everyone killed. Zemke began to wonder whether altitude itself might be the problem. What if the answer was down, not up? The idea sounded insane. Flying low meant not seeing threats until it was almost too late. It meant one slip and you'd crater into French soil. It meant German flak could track you easier. Every manual called low-level penetration suicide for single-engine fighters. But compared to what? Compared to the current survival rate, Zemke argued to himself, which clearly wasn't working. In late September 1943, he quietly pulled aside 3 of his most experienced pilots, Captain Walker Mahurin, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, and Captain Jerry Johnson, and told them to forget everything they'd been taught about altitude. After bomber escort ended on the next mission, he wanted them to drop all the way down, not 10,000 feet, not 5,000, but to treetop level. If they were court-martialed, he would take the blame. They agreed.
On September 27, 1943, those 3 P-47s dove from 18,000 feet to 200 feet over the French countryside. They skimmed the trees, throttles forward, doing 350 miles per hour. What happened next changed everything. They found a German airfield near Beauce with Fw-190s lined up like toys. The Luftwaffe crews never saw them coming. The Thunderbolt screamed across the field at propeller height, guns hammering. 4 Fw-190s detonated before the defenders were even at their stations. The 3 Americans pulled up, stayed low, and flew home. 0 losses, 4 kills. A revolution had begun. Flying at treetop level wasn't just flying low, it weaponized physics. Radar, vectors, and climb rates that had been Germany's advantages collapsed close to the ground. Freya and Wurzburg radar could spot formations at altitude, but radar waves travel in straight lines, and the Earth is curved. Below a few hundred feet, you drop into ground clutter. Returns scattered by hills, buildings, and trees. At 50 feet, you effectively became a ghost. You were a screaming shadow, visible only when you were already on top of them. The reaction time advantage was brutal. A German pilot sipping coffee while warming an engine might get a 3-minute warning when Allies were at altitude, enough time to take off and climb. At 50 feet, the first warning was the howl of R-2800s over the treetops. From sound to impact, 11 seconds, not enough time to man the flak, to get airborne, to prepare. Pilots were strafed while still climbing into their cockpits. It was slaughter, not combat. Speed itself became a shield. A P-47 at full throttle at ground level was moving too fast for gunners trained on high-altitude tracking. Light flak and 20mm or 37mm batteries calculate lead for high, predictable targets. Hedge hopping at 350 miles per hour gave them neither time nor a predictable track. By the time a shell reached the expected intercept point, you were half a mile past it. Gunners who could track slow, steady targets were blind to a blur that appeared and vanished. Pursuit tactics reversed. A Bf-109 that dived to engage at 50 feet found itself with no room to maneuver. Every aggressive turn risked impact with a hillside or a tree. The hunter suddenly faced the possibility of killing himself. Most German pilots backed off. Pilots who'd been comfortable at 10,000 feet discovered that at 40 feet the psychology flipped. The prey became calm, The hunter panicked.
Terrain became cover, the way depth is a submarine's friend. See an enemy above you. Drop into a river valley and follow the curves. The pursuer either loses sight or follows into a maze where his speed is a liability. Towns, hedgerows, church steeples, and water towers became shields. The Americans had not only stolen the sky, they had turned the ground into a weapon. The P-47 was not designed for hedge hopping. Republic Aviation built a 7-ton monster meant to escort bombers in the thin air of the stratosphere. Its R-2800 double-row radial was optimized for high-altitude power. When pilots started bringing Thunderbolts down to treetop level in late 1943, they came back with shredded belly panels, smashed oil coolers, and stories of impacts that should have killed them. Engineers realized they'd accidentally built a nearly indestructible low-level fighter. They only needed to finish the work. Survival engineering followed. Beginning in December 1943, Republic added quarter-inch armor plating to the belly and lower engine cowling, not to stop bullets so much as to protect the airplane from France, tree strikes, wire strikes, and the cheap violence of rural obstacles. Reinforced brackets protected oil coolers after several aircraft limped home with punctured systems. One pilot, Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, famously landed back at base with a 6-foot tree branch jammed in his landing gear. The armor had saved the lines. Gunnery and sighting changed too. High-altitude reflector sights were tuned for deflection shooting at distant maneuvering targets. At ground level, the targets were often stationary, parked aircraft, locomotives, fuel trucks. Republic and the service crews began installing and calibrating gyroscopic sights better suited to instant acquisition. Put the pipper on, squeeze, and .50 caliber Brownings did the rest. Bomb racks and release mechanisms were reworked for low-altitude delivery. Skip bombing techniques borrowed from the Pacific allowed 500-pound bombs to be used against concrete while keeping the release aircraft alive. The P-47 D-25 rolled out in March 1944 with reinforced wing roots to handle the stresses of violent low-level pullouts. The most important change was tactical training. By spring 1944, replacement pilots in England passed through hedge-hopping qualification courses. They flew navigation runs at treetop level to learn terrain reading at 300+ miles per hour. They practiced snapshots at ground targets in 1-second windows. Formations trained to fly at hedge height until flying low felt like the norm rather than a death sentence. The instructors were the survivors of months over France, whose lesson was plain. Altitude kills you. Speed saves you. Trust the Thunderbolt's toughness.
April 8, 1944, was the day the Luftwaffe learned that nowhere was safe anymore. Zemke had spent months perfecting the tactic, rotating pilots through the course, studying intelligence, and waiting for the right moment. When spring weather cleared over Normandy and reports showed elite German wings rotating through forward bases, he unleashed everything in coordinated low-level strikes. 48 P-47s from the 56th, 78th, and 353rd Fighter Groups crossed the coast, split after landfall, and dropped to 100, then 50 feet. They thundered across the Norman countryside in 4-ship flights. The first flight hit at 0700. Bf-109s were on the ground in various states of readiness, taxiing, being fueled, pilots still climbing in. The Thunderbolts screamed over the perimeter and the flight line. 11 enemy fighters were burning hulks before the defenders could respond. No flak, no effective intercepts, just speed, steel, and surprise. The beauty of coordinated low-level strikes was timing. The Luftwaffe's command structure relied on radar, radio, and centralized control. When Evra was hit, controllers tried to vector fighters elsewhere, but the Americans were already in the next field. Bernay was hit 8 minutes later, another base 4 minutes after that. P-47 struck 7 airfields across a 40-mile radius in quick succession. German pilots who did scramble found themselves chasing targets they could not see, and into altitude bands where one mistake meant instant death. The week's operations, later nicknamed the Chattanooga Choo-Choo runs when they began hitting trains, destroyed aircraft on the ground, wrecked locos and supply columns, and shredded the Luftwaffe's tempo. Losses were staggeringly asymmetric. Dozens of German aircraft and locomotives versus 3 P-47s lost on one offensive. It was a 15-to-1 advantage in attrition. Panic rippled through German command when they heard wild boys were in the air. Power lines were worse. Thin, nearly invisible against the landscape, and strung between wooden poles at exactly the altitude American pilots were flying, they sliced through aluminum like wire. In April and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost several P-47s to unseen wires, losses not counted as enemy action, but devastating all the same. Hedge-hopping wasn't doctrine, it was improvisation made doctrine by necessity and brute results. It exposed the Luftwaffe's weakest seams at once: radar, reaction time, dispersal, and the safe sanctity of their own airfields. It forced German commanders into impossible choices between readiness and survival. It turned physics into an ally. At 50 feet, the ground became the cloak, speed the armor, and surprise the weapon. And for the men in the cockpits, it came down to one hard, simple calculus. Altitude had turned into a death sentence. Down low, in the roar and the blur, you had a better chance of coming home.